The Old Testament speaks of a great journey to salvation in a promised land. Since those ancient times, another epic story of history and heritage has been lived by daughters and sons of Africa, seeking the Almighty. Carried across vast seas by the power of empire and missionary zeal from a Bethlehem stable, the Christian world in the 1600s had reached the land that would be known as Canada. Black Canadian Christianity begins in 1632 New France with the story of Olivier Lejeune.
Olivier Lejeune was the first black resident of Canada, and he was also our first recorded slave sale.
During his baptism by the Catholic priest from whom he obtained his surname, Lejeune criticized the hypocrisy of a ritual that pretended to confer unto him a spiritual equality, while as a slave he possessed no rights or freedom. His words summarize the reality for blacks in New France.
Most of the orders held slaves, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the sisters, and yet they allowed slaves to participate in the Mass. Slaves were baptized, and often their masters would be at their baptism, and the masters themselves would set them up as their godchildren. And so it was a really almost incestuous type of slavery.
They lived in the homes of their masters. They slept right in the bedroom with the white children that they were caring for. They were eligible to marry. They were eligible to participate in the offices of the church, and they were eligible to take communion. They were eligible for all those things under Roman Catholic doctrine. However,
very, very clearly they were prevented from taking any kind of holy orders, so they could not be nuns or priests. And because of this kind of paternalistic setup with the church, we don't see in history a kind of an indigenous black Catholic church that rose out of that.
There was a deliberate mission on the part of the Roman Catholic Church in New France to convert the slaves, but there was no slave church.
By 1688, some of the most influential citizens of New France complained of having too few servants, such as Olivier Lejeune, at their disposal. They took heart in King Louis XIV's sensitivity to their hardship and the proclamation he issued in response to their need. As the decades passed, the greatest threat to blacks in New France was posed not by the weather, but by an unholy alliance of power between the slave-owning class and the Catholic Church, as exemplified by one woman's story.
Marie Joseph Angelique, her story disturbs me today, and so it should.
Marie Joseph Angelique, slave, mistress of a slave master, who fell out of favor.
She had a lover who was a indentured servant from France, and she planned on being with him and having a family. She discovered that her master was going to sell her. And in a fit of rage, protest, fear, she set her master's house on fire.
The fire that ensued from trying to escape burned down half of old Montreal, including, I think, one of the more prominent churches as well.
After Angelique's fire in 1734 destroyed some 46 buildings, including a convent and the famous L'Hôtel Dieu, she was apprehended, beaten mercilessly, and paraded through the city in an ox cart. She was then taken to the parish church at Place d'Armes and severely tortured in front of a priest until she confessed.
At that point, her hand was chopped off. Then she was taken to be hanged. After she was hanged, she was burned at the stake, and her body was scattered to the four corners of the earth.
Sometimes we forget that in this country where we sought freedom from slavery, slavery actually existed. and that in many cases it was sanctioned by the church.
Many of the laws and the way that the laws were enacted were deeply connected with the Catholic Church. And so this was condoned, instituted, and sentence delivered hand in hand with the Catholic Church. There's a story in the Bible of a concubine who was brutally raped, and when her owner discovered what had happened to her, he cut her body up into pieces and sent her body parts out to the tribes of Israel to tell them that they had to take justice because of what had been happened. Every time I hear her story, I think of that story of that woman.
The collision between blacks and Christianity in New France had been a stifling and destructive meeting that curtailed black freedom and spiritual expression. It would not be until the American Revolution sparked a great migration of black United Empire loyalists to Nova Scotia in 1783 that black churches would be established in Canada.
That first major migration was the bedrock for the black communities of Nova Scotia. The first major migration established communities in the Preston area, as well as in Shelburne area, in a place called Birchtown. And that was crucial because Birchtown became the first free black settlement of African people in North America.
They understood that the American Revolution was not about freedom for them, and therefore took action, which was to say, we are getting out of this place.
Those who came, about 3,500 who came into the Maritimes and a few dozen into Ontario, they were brought by the British over a period of a few months.
And the British, of course, had promised them land, 10 acres, a cow, and 2 sheep. That was the deal. So they arrive in Shelburne or Port Roseway, and they don't have the land, or the land that they are given is extremely poor, and the British are going about breaking their promises, in essence, in terms of equal treatment for black loyalists along with white loyalists.
It was such a difference. And so even then, we were facing institutional and systemic racism.
Nobody had to legislate segregation in Nova Scotia or gain New Brunswick or Prince Edward Island because it was set up by the settlement patterns. White town, black village.
Far enough out of town that they wouldn't disrupt the social life of the white people, but close enough so they could come into work.
And so you had a situation set up of economic dependency, but also racial separateness that contributed to a sense of distinctiveness because you did have your own community. Even if the land was rocky, stony, boggy, marshy, impossible to farm, it was yours.
And they were skilled laborers. In some cases, they were better at doing the different jobs than the general community was. As a result, there was a riot that took place in 1784 in Shelburne by the white disbanded soldiers who were so upset that the black men were getting the jobs that the white men weren't. And so they actually invaded the black community.
This first race riot was, in fact, a white riot against the black settlers. It led to an interest in developing separate infrastructure. And of course, that led to the creation of various church movements, chapel movements, and so on.
They were not given any kind of elevation in the church. You could only be part of the congregation. You would never be allowed to become an elder or a deacon or, God forbid, a minister.
As more and more loyalists came, some with blacks who were slaves, so you had slaves and then you had free blacks, they began to push the blacks to the back of the church.
There was areas where they were only allowed to sit in certain pews. They weren't allowed to sit near the pulpits. Until
the point where the white settlers couldn't stand to look at the black folk, and they put them up in the balconies.
In St. Paul's Church in Halifax, for example, the balcony was referred to as the slave pews, because slave Christians sat up there before there were any free blacks coming in.
And they were referred to quite blatant and racist as nigger heaven or nigger pews.
When they didn't want that anymore, they put a curtain to block them from their view, and at that point, many of the black Christians chose to meet in their own homes or meeting houses, still under the supervision of the Anglican Church.
Most of the Anglican clergymen would appoint a black person to be a lay reader. There was a man named Joseph Leonard who was appointed to be such a lay reader in a black community called Brindleytown near Digby. And the Bishop Inglis of Nova Scotia, he went on his annual visitation, I guess, to confirm children and to perform the various offices that were required for a bishop. And he discovered that Joseph Leonard was doing everything that in normal circumstances a priest of the Anglican Church did. He was burying, he was marrying, he was doing communion, he was doing all the things that you had to be a priest to do. And so I'm getting this story from Bishop Inglis's own diary. He says, I admonished Leonard and told him that he wasn't supposed to be doing these things. It wasn't allowed. Whereupon, according to the bishop, Leonard replied, if that's the situation, then we wish to have a church of our own. We wish to have an independent church.
Early black Canadian Christians saw themselves as special in the eyes of God, whom they believed spoke to them directly. Meanwhile, Christianity in the late 18th century was undergoing a great awakening. New ideas about how to celebrate faith swept north from the United States, challenging established religious structures.
There was a wave of religious energy that swept through the country. In Canada, that was most clearly expressed, I think, by Henry Line.
What he was challenging was overly institutionalized Christianity. He preached that we don't need the institution. We don't need to go through somebody who's been ordained. We don't need a bishop. What we need to do is go directly to our Creator. So although it wasn't designed for the free African-American stroke African-Canadian population, it certainly suited their needs at the time.
It was the perfect type of expression for many settlers, black and white, who were just, struggling with what it meant to be in frontier Canada and not feeling that their needs were being met by the mother church, the Anglican Church. And so blacks immediately gravitated.
David George, who'd been a black preacher as a slave, became a black loyalist, came to Canada, to Nova Scotia, and began to preach, established a church. And he also went on the circuit and preached in other communities and established other Baptist churches around the province.
Certainly David George, when he first came here, met under trees, in clearings, in halls. That was where they worshiped the Lord. Because what we have to understand is that the church isn't particularly a building. Church are the people of God coming together to worship. So you can have church anywhere. Those early gatherings of people for worship would probably have been something beautiful to see. In earlier days of David George, there wasn't a script. So if someone was filled with the Spirit and felt like singing, then they would sing. If someone felt like testifying, then they would testify.
People could come and express themselves, things you couldn't do on your job if you did have one. You were able to do within the context of the church. You had a vote, for example. You could be involved in decision making, and you felt as if you were a part of something bigger than yourself.
His congregations that he established weren't just black. White folk came too, and First Nations folk people came. And there's this amazing story, well, to me it's amazing as a Baptist minister, a story when he was trying to baptize a white woman, and her family protested.
David George described the scene in his journal. Brother Holmes and his wife came up with me to Shelburne and were baptized on the Lord's Day. Their relations who lived in the town were very angry, raised a mob, and endeavored to hinder their being baptized. Mrs. Holmes' sister especially laid hold of her hair to keep her from going down into the water, but the justices commanded peace and said she should be baptized as she herself desired.
And so finally, David George had to apply for a license to preach. And his license specified that he was licensed to preach to the black population.
David George's loud preaching and race-mixing calls to God made him a target during the Shelburne riot of 1784. Angry whites destroyed his home, which also served as his church. A mob beat him and set fire to the chapel, but David George escaped with his family to the black settlement of Birchtown.
To think of a mob of white people just going in and stoning him and turning his home upside down, his church upside down, chasing him.
He had to rebuild another church, and the church that he had, they actually transformed it into a tavern.
As several difficult years passed, the black loyalists began searching for a way out of Nova Scotia. They sent a representative to London who attracted interest in their plight. These efforts led to a mass exodus of the black community from Nova Scotia in 1792 under the leadership of David George and others. Despite its mythology, Canada had not been the promised land for which the Loyalists had hoped.
It was based on the fact that the Loyalists were denied things that they had been promised, a better way of life. 1,200 of the black loyalists who had settled in Nova Scotia did leave in 1792 because the conditions were awful. They were awful, and people were starving, people were dropping dead in the streets, people were being forced into slavery once again. And so, as they'd made the decision to leave the United States in the first place, they would again go into the unknown, go to Africa in order to have their land, their church, their independence.
This was the thing that really turned their heads towards Sierra Leone. They would be allowed religious freedom. They could be free to be Baptist and Methodist and the different denominational affiliations that they had chosen.
White power, which was definitely opposed to black people leaving Nova Scotia. They were definitely opposed to it. They wanted to keep everybody in a position of being essentially near slavery.
They didn't want them in their churches. They didn't want them to have the jobs. They didn't want them to have the land. When the black folk decided, okay, well, we're leaving and we're going back to Africa, they didn't want them to leave. In the end, the third that went represented all of the ministers, all of the teachers, all of the leaders.
The void that it created was tremendous to recover from.
The people who were left were more or less slaves. Nova Scotia did have slaves, those who couldn't leave, as well as those who were so far out into other areas that they did not hear about the Exodus until it was over.
15 ships left Halifax Harbor, January 15, 1792, carrying these pilgrims, I like calling them pilgrims, to Africa.
I've tried, oh Lord, I am coming home. I've wasted many prayers.
The themes of Exodus, Promised Land are integral to understanding the black Christian experience in Canada. What does it mean to have left your home or to have had an historical experience of leaving?
Exodus 3, 7 through 10. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey.
There's a concept that Canada was the promised land. Of course, there would be some thinking that would develop where I could go to a better place. And I didn't want it to be after I died.
And when we think of how God led the Israelites from Egypt, a land of slavery, a land of oppression and depression and suppression, to the promised land, a land of opportunity, a land of blessing, a land of deliverance, a land of freedom.
And so you have, in a sense, an appropriation, if you will, of Jewish history in the Old Testament to account for the experiences of black people with plantocracy America as Egypt, as the enslavers of God's people, black people cast as Israel, Canada as Canaan. And that's why I think that the Exodus story, this notion of migration, of leaving one place and going to some place better, that has figured so prominently in black religious experience of Christianity, because it is a migratory experience. The existential predicament of enslaved peoples is freedom, how to be free. And the Exodus story has been used to try to imagine a way out.
Again, speak about the Israelites. Speak about the millions of immigrants who have come to North America and Canada in specific to enjoy the freedom that legislations and just plain hard work, the Black Canadian has allowed the rest of the world to enjoy, because freedom is what we all want.
In 1793, the year after 1,200 black loyalists sailed for Sierra Leone, Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe banned slave imports to Upper Canada. New legislation freed all slaves in the colony at age 25. Black communities flourished in the early 1800s as thousands fled the United States, their numbers increasing after slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire in 1834. These freedom seekers carried seeds of religious expression which took root in Canada.
The slaveholding class believed that it was in their interests to make the slaves Christians. But by being permissive of Christianity in their own supposed interests, the slaveholders actually encouraged and facilitated the slaves to have an independent life, an institutional life, in their own control.
We banded together in the church. The place we had been taken to be controlled became the place that allowed us to be free. And that brought us over Jordan into Canaan land to freedom.
As soon as they reached the promised land, Canada, they worshiped. These stories are told.
So in some instances, what would happen is that people would meet in homes. There would be itinerant ministers that would come around until the community was in a position to have the resources in order to build a church.
You'll often find in some of these southwestern Ontario communities that the first church was a black church. So the black people didn't set out to exclude the whites excluded themselves.
We were the leaders. We were the conductors of the services. We were the ones who made the decision on what the congregation would study and how we would present ourselves to the world. Those of us who knew how to read and write took teaching positions in the church. We were the educators. The church suppers were a way of learning etiquette. Everything we did had a learning component attached to it within the church.
Oh, Lord, I want to live faithful each day. Let me walk in your true way. I'm telling this world, Lord, what a Savior one day I found. And I'm spreading your gospel all around. Oh, Lord, I want to live faithful each day. Let me walk in your true way. I'm telling this world, Lord, what a Savior one day I found. And I'm spreading the gospel all around.
Crows crack a white porcelain sky, carve one fine black line. Through the fracture, some light falls, filters but little. Beneath that pale plate, I was pressed, flattened, made weary, the same as everyone, my gospel fire fainting. Then I found a few believers, forest boards, and stoked a bonfire church in the name of God and the old songs no other church would sing. We dark ones joined, becoming incendiary, one vast conflagration unto God.
By 1860, there are roughly 4 million enslaved Africans in the United States. Forcibly transplanted to a new land, they've brought with them a rich African heritage, including songs. Adapted to reflect the experiences of life of hard labor on plantations, these slave work songs, laments, and shouts of protest evolve into a new musical form, the spiritual. The spiritual will in turn become the wellspring for generations of musicians who will create the blues, gospel, jazz, and the protest songs of the 1960s.
Ain't but me one, me one, Lord, it ain't but me one. Well, it used to be one. Tell 'em, Mom. Two. God knows it was. Three. Sometime there used to be 4, 5, 6. God knows you look, you seen about 7, 8, 9, Lord, it ain't but me one. Well, we used to go around y'all singing God's praise. We had a whole group, y'all singing along with me. But now that the Holy Ghost done called them home, now Lord, it ain't but me one. That's what I love about my mother, with the songs we sang, we got the history of the song. And Ain't But Me One that's a slave song. That song was written way back when a gentleman was a slave. He was brought over and his family was on the next ship coming. And they all died. And when he caught up with the captain that was of that ship, slave ship coming in, he said, my family was on this ship and I don't see any of them. And they gave, then it was numbers and what have you, it was markers and they didn't, or tribes, and they didn't have names yet till you was born. So he said, well, what tribe? And he told him the tribe, and he told him the number, whatever it was, could have been. He said, oh, all of them died on the way over. And that's when that song popped out. Ain't but me one. It was only him left. He said, then it's just me now.
There was a fear that somehow to hold a fellow Christian in bondage was illegal. And a number of colonial legislatures very quickly passed legislation that said baptizing a slave does not change the slave's status.
The Virginia Assembly in 1664 decreed that it was indeed possible for Africans to be both enslaved and Christians. So following that, there was a conversion of Africans to Christianity. This entailed religious instruction and instruction in religious music.
Praise God from whom all blessings flow. The congregation then would sing, praise God from whom all blessings flow. The leader, praise him all Christians here below. The congregation, praise him. That's not what the black people did. As a matter of fact, they say that they don't line a hymn, they raise a hymn. Now, we have letters from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel written in 1755 describing this. And what they actually did was a person who will later on becomes a deacon sings 2 lines in a rather ornamented fashion, and then the congregation brings in all of the curlicues and flowers that the Africans tend to decorate their songs with, so that in a Watts hymn like Come Ye That Love the Lord, the deacon would sing, come ye that love the Lord, and let your joy be known. Then the congregation begins, come ye that love the Lord. Well, well, you're not going to get anything like that out of the Presbyterian Church.
The slaves, when they were carried away from Africa, did not leave their religion or music behind. When you listen to the spirituals, when you listen very carefully, you can find rhythmic patterns that are very significant, related to African music. When you listen to the harmonies, very simple harmonies, you'll find a lot of that in African music, because most people in Africa do not know how to write music, but they can harmonize.
My Lord, what a morning. My Lord, what a morning. My Lord, what a morning. When the stars began to fall. You'll hear the Christian shout to wake the nations underground, looking to my God's right hand. When the stars began to fall, my Lord, what a morning. My Lord, what a morning. My Lord, what a morning. When the stars began to fall.
In the African religion, remember, there had to be the music, there had to be the preacher, and there had to be the congregation, you see. And that's where the whole form of the music comes from, call and response. There's particularly the blues and gospel, you have a call and response, which goes way back to ancient agrarian society, but as a religious term, it is the preacher and the response. And whether you could be listening to Michael Jackson, you'll still hear the same, "Devil baby, baby, oh, no, no, baby, baby."
Musically, our music has always been free. We've been free to express it rhythmically, free to express it harmonically. That freedom was somehow taken away from us by missionaries who attempt to bring Christianity to us. And in the deliverance of Christianity, pulled out that which they considered to be unfit for our musical expression.
The whole emotional aspect of the African culture and religion was thought of as, quote, childish from the beginning. You understand what I mean? And, but they found out other things that altered that somewhat. For instance, why they took the drum away. They found out that the drum, they weren't just beating on that wood, that they were actually, communicating with each other. And usually after they beat on that wood a little while, where the term rap actually comes from. When they got through rapping on that wood, then all kinds of things would happen. The storehouse might burn up, the slaves would run off, somebody would get poisoned. So very quickly, they had to take that drum away from the slaves, which then made the slaves, all the music that they made is like percussive without the drum.
gradually, even as early as the 1800s, this enthusiasm begins to affect white congregations. As a matter of fact, in the 1800 revival, we began to see an exchange of singing between the slaves and the white Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians. And this was the cause for an 1819 book by John Fanning Watson called The Methodist Era, where he chastises them for singing like those songs that were first composed in the colored community, he calls it. Not only were they frightened because it was new, they were frightened because it was different, and they were slightly angry because something that was so important to them, something that was so necessary to their own expression, had come from a group that really oughtn't to have had the sense to create this and to bring it.
Many of the slaves were convinced that the people who claimed to be Christians, who were slave masters, could only be one or the other. They couldn't be both. They would either have to be slave masters or they would be Christians. So they discounted their Christianity. In fact, Douglas says the worst of all the slave masters were the religious ones, because they would whip your butt, then go pray it off. You know, I'm sorry I whipped his butt, Lord. You understand what I mean? So the slaves early made that distinction between, you know, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. You see, that's what they're saying. You know, they never believed they were Christians, because they would say, how can you believe in God and do this to me?
18th and 19th centuries, an informal yet massive network of overland routes, safe houses, secret tunnels, and other means of clandestine travel was established by blacks and sympathetic whites to help American slaves reach freedom in Canada. Known as the Underground Railroad, this escape system for decades depended on secrecy and a decentralized structure of operation in which so-called conductors helped to arrange safe passage for fugitives from one secure point northward to the next. To evade capture and avoid exposing common escape routes, fugitives often had to communicate surreptitiously in plain view or within earshot of slave owners. This was sometimes accomplished by planting coded messages in their songs of religious joy.
To give each other information on how to be free. Swing low, sweet chariot.
Swing low, sweet chariot. Response, coming for to carry me home. Now I looked over Jordan and what did I see? Coming for a band of angels coming for to carry me. And then this is all encoded. You would have who's that yonder dressed in red or who's that yonder dressed in black.
Coded messages within songs. A conductor is going to be here and take us to freedom in Canaan land. If you get there before I do, coming for to carry me home, tell all my friends I'm coming too. That's one conductor talking to another. You lead this group of people into Amherstburg, into Windsor, into Buxton, and I'll be there.
Harriet Tubman used to love using Steal Away to Jesus. It's one of her codes, one of her signals.
My Lord, he calls me by the thunder. The trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't got long to stay here.
Listen for the sounds. Look at the night sky. Follow the North Star. That will lead you in the right direction. Regardless of whether anyone else was guiding us or not, we found ways to learn how to guide ourselves.
Follow the drinking gourd. You know, it's another one that very specifically tells people, you know, when the sun comes back and the first quail calls, and what do? You know, the old man is waiting to carry you to freedom.
Follow the drinking gourd, and the old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd.
It talks about a peg-legged man. It talks about crossing the river at a particular point from a slave state to a free state. And it goes on to verbally state in song how to free yourself.
We'll go through some fire
and we'll go through some storms, but we always lean on the everlasting arms of Jesus. And if you're living under a curse, you need to get out from under it. I said, get out from under the curse that the devil has on you.
The first black church in Ontario was established in 1820, lovingly called Salem Chapel in St. Catharines, and also quite famous because it was the church of Harriet Tubman.
Every time I saw a white man, I was afraid of being carried away. I had 2 sisters carried away in a chain gang. One of them left 2 children. We were always uneasy. Now I've been free, I know what a dreadful condition slavery is. I think slavery is the next thing to hell.
Harriet Tubman first came to Canada in 1851. She had her home across the street from the present-day location of the British Methodist Episcopal Church in St. Catharines. Her connection to the BME Church in St. Catharines is important because here is a person who started and ended 11 of her 19 rescue missions on the Underground Railroad from St. Catharines. And in total, she rescued 300 people from Maryland and brought them into the St. Catharines area.
The passage of the American Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 drove even greater numbers of freedom seekers into Canada. The act instituted harsh penalties upon anyone who had knowledge of runaway slaves and did not turn them in to the authorities or slave owners. Nowhere in America was safe.
This act stated that all people on the day that it was passed in September of 1850, that all black people would become chattel. There were people who had been out of slavery maybe 2 generations by this time, but it didn't make any difference. So of course, massive numbers, between 35 and 50,000 people came into Canada.
And there are examples of people doing it as congregations. The group would decide, we can't hang here any longer, it's getting dangerous for us, the slave catchers are sniffing down our backs, and so they would make a decision and come across into Canada, bringing intact their church membership.
There would be families arriving. They would come, they would be welcomed into the church, and often they would have to be hidden.
Many bounty hunters did come across the border. Of course, they frequented the areas like Niagara Falls and Windsor that were some of the main crossings, but they did sometimes make their way to Chatham.
Among the many services and activities that took root within churches and communities across Ontario were vigilance committees, established by citizens to defend the interests, safety, and dignity of black people.
They looked after the welfare of the new people coming in, because most people would come with nothing. And so therefore they were sort of fed and clothed and made ready for getting out into the general community.
An interesting story involving the Vigilance Committee is the story of John Anderson. He was a slave who, in his attempt to free himself, stole a horse and injured his slave owner. He came to Ontario, the Guelph area. The son of the injured slave owner knew where John had come, and he and several of his friends came to collect John and take him back. That case went to the highest courts in Britain. And it was decided in the end analysis that John Anderson could not be taken back to the United States because as a man, he was under British law, which protected him. In the United States of America, John Anderson was not a man, he was an animal, so he couldn't possibly be charged with stealing or any crime for that matter. And as a result of that, the extradition laws in Canada, which are some of the most tightly held extradition laws in the entire world, resulted because of John Anderson. And the Vigilance Committee fought against those men taking John out of the country.
We have been called on to mourn the death of our much esteemed and beloved Brother Preston. There was a dark cloud of sorrow hovered over the churches on the 16th of July, 1861, and very many of the members wept aloud and cried, "My father, my father." Our brother was converted in Virginia, United States of America, in the year 1815.
Our brother was an African man, stolen from Africa, sold in America, and in 1816 he was found clear gone and safely landed in Halifax, Nova Scotia. His heart was filled with joy and he was doubly free, free from sin and free from slavery. The slave that gets his foot upon the shore, his chains fall and binds him no more. What I say unto you, I say unto all, watch and pray, and the very God of heaven will come down and bless you. Amen.
From coast to coast, black churches have long been a part of Canada. In the West, churches were established by groups of free black Americans seeking a place where they could find justice and live without fear. In 1858, word reached the black congregation of Zion Church in San Francisco that land and safety was available in British Columbia.
California at the time was a free state. But under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Act, slave owners could come and retrieve slaves from who'd taken refuge. And so they sent a delegation up to British Canada, and they interviewed the governor in Victoria and to find out if they would be allowed to go there, and they were told that they would. In British Columbia, their community is founded by persons who had been living in freedom for at least some time. They brought an infrastructure with them that wasn't usually possible for people fleeing directly from slavery. The culture they're bringing with them, the skills, the entrepreneurial practices they're bringing with them are different from the mass of persons coming into, say, the Maritimes or into Ontario.
The hundreds of new arrivals to Vancouver Island and Salt Spring Island determined that they would not establish separate black churches. The push for integrated churches was opposed by white settlers, but aided by stands of white clergymen such as Edward Cridge, who refused to accede to white demands for separate services or Negro corners. Though blacks numbered about 20% of Victoria's population by the early 1860s, they comprised half of its church-going population.
They had a meeting and they deliberately decided that they would not establish a segregated black church, that they would integrate in schools, they would integrate in the churches. They wanted to become British. They wanted to be, as the terminology then was, they wanted to fit in. They'd left behind a segregated country, a segregated state, segregated existence, and they were starting a new life, and they wanted to do it from scratch.
By 1909, black farmers from the American Midwest began to settle in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. These pioneers quickly established black churches, simple log cabin structures where services were held.
My mother came from Oklahoma to Alberta. Things were not that wonderful for blacks at the time, and they saw this ad in the paper saying, come up to Canada, and for $10 we will give you the deed to 40 acres, and so long as you cultivate the land would be yours. And they came up and made a home with it, and made a freedom in their heart and their soul that they felt this was the promised land for them. Shiloh Baptist Church in Edmonton, Alberta. That's where I was a little girl, and my mother was the superintendent for the young people. We went to church for the morning service, of course, and then the young people had their service about 12. And then there was a 6 o'clock service for some of the young people, and then there was an evening service. So we were at church all day.
In Vancouver, the Fountain Chapel AME Church was established in 1923 by the city's small but highly concentrated black community. Among its founding members was Nora Hendricks, grandmother of the great musician Jimi Hendrix.
Nora Hendricks is a dear soul who had the music in her. We always felt that we were listening to the real thing. This was the real thing, you know. Whatever we were doing, we were just copying, because, I mean, she was the real thing. And I was so pleased that I got to know her right up till she was 100 years old.
Jazz great Eleanor Collins sang with Nora Hendricks in the Fountain Chapel Church Choir. Before her death, Hendricks recalls how Vancouver's only historically black church, launched with $1,000, came to be. What few colored people they were said, well, we should get a church of our own. Some of the men intercede and got a hold of the high-ups in the States, the AME it was called, and they said, well, if you raise $500, we'll raise $500. So all of the sisters and the brothers and everyone started having entertainments and bazaars and suppers to raise the money to buy this church. So we had our own church then.
Out of the bitter sea I come, raging the faith of the beautiful ones who broke from chains and bastard tongues, to him the insurrectionist spirituals, those homemade songs culled from Potato Patch, Hog Farm, or Stony Beach, those Bible beauty songs plucked from apple trees and guitars. So this is my testament, be it smoke and blood. This is my gospel, be it longing and sorrow. This is my book of songs, echoing the desire of all those who stand on the bouldered shores of the North Atlantic, looking eastward, ever dreaming, ever wanting.
Gospel, by its very nature, is the good news. It comes from a Greek word, euangelion, which means the good news. And the gospel is the good news, and the good news is that God sent Jesus into the world to save sinners.
It's such a testimony to me. Coming off the street, drug dealer 15 years ago, actually getting delivered and being able to express myself now musically. More than good news, I can take it personal and say it's my news.
Something just comes over you. As we sing these songs daily, we get closer and closer together. And it's not by virtue of our characters, it's by virtue of the spirituals themselves.
Do you know what I think is the common denominator of gospel music? Love. L-O-V-E, love. And I think it comes across. And love is healing.